Howdy there, young'uns. Silver Mongoose here, back again from their Buyer's Guide / review for you guys, and today we're going to be talking about the one, the only, SEGA Dreamcast. Now, since the Sega Genesis, Sega had actually been doing pretty poorly. The Genesis attachments and the Saturn were a financial mess, and had soiled the Sega name with gamers around the world. At this point, Sega was actually losing hundreds of millions of dollars a year, and people weren't really sure what Sega was going to do to fix themselves. There were actually rumors of a 64-bit upgrade to the Saturn, but Sega was actually working on its next big system. Originally, the prototype was going to be developed by IBM in the United States to keep the internal political problems of Sega of Japan out of the development cycle. But when the development team at Sega of Japan heard about this, they insisted that they be the ones to make the prototype. So instead of canceling the IBM one, two teams independently built their own prototypes. The IBM prototype was codenamed Black Belt, whereas the Sega of Japan prototype was codenamed Dural, White Belt, and later Katana. It was actually headed by the Sega Genesis creator, Hideki Sato. In the end, Sega chose the Katana over the Black Belt. There were some rumors that the Black Belt wasn't as powerful or would have been more expensive to make. There were also some rumors that the IBM team was actually only put to work to make the Japanese team work harder. Now, some say that the Black Belt was actually a little bit easier to program for, and that the innards of the Katana were tweaked to be easier to program for as well. Now, 3DFX, a company that was supposed to provide technology for the Black Belt, sued Sega because they felt that they were being led on from the very beginning. Now, because this isn't something that's private, the cat was out of the bag. The public knew that Sega's next-gen system was coming. Now, the Katana was supposed to be everything the Saturn wasn't. As much as I love the Saturn, the thing was difficult to program for, it was expensive, and it didn't have that much third-party support. So it was made with simple off-the-shelf parts that were commonly used in PCs. They even actually worked with Microsoft to include Windows CE compatibility to make ports from PCs easier. To make it cheaper, they didn't include a DVD drive, and to ensure more games, they purchased the Studio Visual Concepts with the primary function of making sports titles for them. Not only that, but they were going to do something revolutionary. They were going to bring the internet to your home console. Now, having a home console on the internet was actually nothing new, but thanks to people like Sega of America President Bernie Stoller pushing for a modem in every single system, the Katana was the first system to be internet ready right out of the box. They were hyping up the internet capabilities like mad. They were promising 6 billion players. And other than being able to surf the internet and check your email, they also said you'd be able to download entire new levels for Sonic Adventure, be able to get new items, new characters for games like Soul Calibur, and that you'd be able to use a microphone and a camera to talk to and see the players you're facing online. There was even a rumor that single-player games on the system would be hard to find after a year because of the awesome internet capabilities. At this point, Sega decided their name was so sullied they weren't even going to include it on their new system. From a pool of 5,000 names, they chose the Dreamcast as the name of their new system, and in the end, they actually ended up including their logo on the front there anyways. But I still feel that the Dreamcast really is a name of its own. Now, the advertising for this was viral. They were handing out t-shirts and pins and tattoos and things at concerts. They had booths set up at events with Dreamcast so people could play. They're driving a van across America to get people to play the system. They had celebrities endorsing it. They spent even $1.4 million on a single commercial, and one year they even sponsored the MTV Music Awards with the Dreamcast. In the end, Sega spent $500 million on Dreamcast, half of that being advertisement, and the other half being development and software. Sega was confident that they'd be able to recapture 50% of the gaming market with the Dreamcast. Keep in mind, at this point, they actually only had 5% of the market. Now, the Sega of America President Bernie Stoller was actually fired right before the launch of the Dreamcast in the US. It was rumored that this was because he went against his Japanese superiors and decided to launch the Dreamcast at $199 instead of $249. The North American launch on 9/9/99 was a huge success. At the time, it was the biggest launch in entertainment history. Within 24 hours, Sega made $97 million, which is even more than what Star Wars Episode 1 made. Within 2 weeks, Sega had sold 500,000 Dreamcasts, making it its most successful North American hardware launch ever. Even though they were confident in their head start, they did have some issues. For example, games like Blue Stinger were actually shipped with defective discs and had to be replaced. And even though you could surf the web as soon as you got your Dreamcast, it took about half a year for the first internet game, Choo Choo Rocket, to even come out. And when it did come out, it was really laggy. And that's because Sega artificially inserted lag into the code to see how players would react. Probably not the best idea. Still, they soon had 300,000 people using the internet on their Dreamcasts. Now at this point, it looked like the Dreamcast was Sega's big comeback, but they didn't really keep the momentum for a couple of reasons. One was that the third-party support still wasn't really there. Now, the Saturn was still fresh in EA's memory, and they stated that they would only develop games for the Dreamcast if they could be the exclusive sports developer. Now, Sega just spent $10 million in visual concepts just to make them sports games, so they said no. Other developers didn't release games at all, and some only released one or two just to test the waters. For example, Namco only released a handful of titles for the system. It was a really bad cycle where people weren't making games for the system because they weren't selling enough systems, and people weren't buying enough systems because there weren't that many games being developed for it. It also didn't really help that you could pretty easily burn games and use pirated copies of games on your Dreamcast. Now, the second big reason was that people were anticipating the more powerful DVD-capable PlayStation 2. And whenever the PS2 released in October 2000 in North America, the Dreamcast days were pretty much numbered. Now, they went through multiple price cuts to try to help, and at one point Sega even offered a $150 rebate to anybody who signed up to SegaNet for 2 years, basically making the system free. And though this did help, Sega still only recaptured 15% of the gaming market. By February 2001, Dreamcasts were only $99, and by March, they stopped making Dreamcasts altogether. They still had more systems in stock than they had even sold. The final units were cut to $50, and that was the end of that. The Dreamcast had sold 10 million units in its lifetime. Now, this was sad not only because it was the death of the Dreamcast, but because it was the death of Sega as a home hardware developer altogether. After years of financial woes, they decided they weren't going to make another home system. It was just going to focus on software. So a lot of its software was actually divided among the other systems. For example, Xbox got Panzer Dragoon and Jet Grand Radio, Sony got Virtua Fighter and Space Channel 5, and Nintendo got ports like Sonic Adventure and Skies of Arcadia. Now, the Dreamcast was technically a financial failure, but it still holds its place in many gamers' hearts, and some revere it to be one of the greatest systems ever made. Now on to the system itself. Now, overall, I think the Dreamcast has a very nice design. It's a very good looking system, and it's fairly compact. If you haven't held a Dreamcast before, they're fairly heavy. On the top here you have the orange Dreamcast logo. In PAL regions it's actually blue because a German company, Tivola, had a very similar logo, so they had to change it for copyright reasons. You have your power button here. You have this clear spot here, which is actually an orange light that turns on whenever the Dreamcast is on. Very cool. And here is the open button, which opens the GD-ROM drive. So the Dreamcast does play GD-ROMs, which hold a gig of data, which at the time was actually fairly large. And it's a fairly noisy disc player as well. So whenever it's loading, it'll make kind of a scratching noise. All Dreamcasts do this, so don't worry if you're a new Dreamcast owner and you hear a Dreamcast making that noise. It does also play CDs, so you can play your music CDs in there. On the front, you just have the Sega logo there, 4 controller ports, and here it says it's compatible with Windows CE. So like I said earlier, Windows CE is compatible with this system, which was actually admittedly put in just to kind of entice PC developers to come over and make games for the Dreamcast. But almost nobody used it because the Dreamcast native OS was actually much faster and easier to develop for, so only a handful of games actually used this. On the side here, there isn't actually anything except for the modem, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Here there's nothing, and on the bottom there's really nothing as well. So on the back there are tons of things here. All the way on the side here you see that there is something that says line, and that is so you can connect your phone jack so you can connect to the internet with your Dreamcast. It's just a 56K modem here. You actually can get some higher speed connections for your Dreamcast because this does come out here, but they are fairly expensive to get. Also over here you have the AC in, and you guessed it, that is to plug your system into the wall and give it some power. And what's great about the AC cable for the Dreamcast is that there's no stupid brick in the middle or on the end. It is just your standard cord, which is just fantastic. I love that about the Dreamcast. Below that you'll see something that says serial, and that was primarily supposed to be for upgrades. Whenever the Dreamcast was being developed, they said it's okay that we're going to be the first system out of the gate because the Dreamcast is going to be upgradable. you'll be able to upgrade it to keep up with the other systems like the PS2 and the GameCube whenever they came up. Also, you'll be able to use it for future peripherals, like the zip drive that was supposed to come out in the early 2000s. It was supposed to have 100 megabytes of data storage, so you could, store emails or internet files, internet settings, have patches for your games, update your sports stats, things like that. You could also use it for connectivity to your Neo Geo Pocket Color for a few games if you have one of those, and the connector cable, and the 2 games that work for it. Very limited connectability there. And at one point they even said you'd be able to use a DVD drive with this. I guess they were trying to stop people from buying a PS2 just based on that, but it's kind of silly in my opinion. Here you have the AV out, and there's lots and lots of options here. I just have the standard composite here. It just plugs right in there very easily. And you could also have RF, S-Video, VGA, so there's lots of options for hooking this up to your TV. Now, inside the Dreamcast there's actually 128K of internal memory, which was used primarily for keeping time and some very simple internet settings. You can replace the battery with some difficulty. I don't really see the point. You can just leave your Dreamcast plugged in and that'll solve the problem, and other than just having to reset your time whenever you turn your Dreamcast on if it's not plugged in, there's no real reason why you need to replace that battery. It's not that big of a deal. Inside the first wave of Japanese Dreamcasts, they actually had a liquid cooling system because the GPU chips were running so hot, but soon after they actually fixed that problem, so they didn't need the liquid cooling system.